Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on October 16th, 2023, for a teach-in on Gaza hosted by the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. My name is Sahar Aziz, and I serve as the Executive Director of CSRR. I am also a distinguished law professor and Chancellor Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers Law School in Newark, which we proudly call the People's Electric Law School. I'm also the author of The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights is the first and only civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses on the civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in the United States, as well as geopolitical issues that affect them and their civil and human rights. We look at three main categories, including the intersection of race and religion, the criminalization of Muslim identity through securitization practices and policies, and transnational rights and security that also impact the civil and human rights of our diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. Please follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR on Instagram and Twitter at RUCSRR. And if you are interested in supporting us, I encourage you to go to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, press the donate button, and donate generously. We rely on our funders and our donors, our private donors, to support our work, which we offer free of charge. Today is we are in a very difficult time, and we intentionally held this teach-in as a form of education, because one cannot understand the present without understanding the past. And anytime there is conflict, dispute, there is always complexity and nuance. In today's teach-in on Gaza, we will be intentionally centering the experiences of Palestinians, because in the US media, in the rhetoric by US government officials from the local, the state, and the federal level, all of the coverage and the discourse has erased the experiences of Palestinians and their perspectives and their voices. So today, I am honored to introduce to you the presenter of the teach-in, Zachary Foster, who holds a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University and is a senior fellow at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Zach publishes a weekly newsletter called, quote, Palestine in Your Inbox, end quote, which is available at www.palestine.beehive.com, and Beehive is spelled Beehiive. So if you're interested in learning more about his work, I encourage you to do so. The presentation will be about 1 hour, and then after that, we will accept Q&A, and I will moderate the discussion. So without further ado, Mr. Foster, or Dr. Foster, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen and you can hear me okay. We've got 50 slides to go through in 60 minutes, so let's get started. Gaza. Some basic facts and figures, just so we're all on the same page. Gaza is currently home to more than 2 million Palestinians, more than half of whom are children, 70% of whom are refugees or descendants of refugees from the 1948 war. From 48 to 67, Egypt occupied Gaza. From 67 to 2007, Israel occupied Gaza. And, excuse me, beginning in 2007, Gaza was placed under a full Israeli-led and Egyptian-supported land, sea, and air blockade. And at the same time, human rights organizations like the UN and many other legal scholars nevertheless still regard Gaza Strip to be under military occupation because of that blockade. From the inside, Gaza is ruled by Hamas, an organization originally established as an Islamic charity which evolved into a militant organization in the 90s and 2000s. And like I said, Hamas came to power after it won free and fair democratic elections in 2006 and came to power in Gaza in 2007 and has ruled the territory ever since. Okay, let's talk briefly about Egypt's occupation of Gaza, which sets the stage for Israel's occupation of Gaza. So during the 1948 war, you had something like 200,000 Palestinian refugees flee to Gaza from areas that were later conquered by the state of Israel. Remember, Gaza was already home to 70,000 Palestinians before it received another 200,000 Palestinians who were fleeing fleeing war in 48. And most of those refugees found themselves in absolutely abysmal conditions, suffering in overcrowding camps, and living in a state of total impoverishment. When Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip in 48, it subjected Palestinians in Gaza to martial law in 1962. It prevented those Palestinians from fleeing Gaza. You couldn't leave Gaza under Egyptian rule. You were also restricted in your employment opportunities and where you could live. In 1956, recall Israel, together with Britain and France, invaded Egypt. They tried to occupy the Suez Canal in the famous Suez Crisis of 1956. During Israel's invasion of Gaza in 1956, it massacred many hundreds of Palestinians. Those massacres are not very well known today, but in fact, Israel actually occupied the Gaza Strip for nearly a year in 1956 and 1957, or for many months, in 56 and 57. Here you have an image of from one of the refugee camps in Gaza in 1956. Okay, so in June 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Jerusalem, Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights in the war that completely transformed the Middle East. During that war, when Israel conquered the Gaza Strip, it led to the creation of another 70,000 Palestinian refugees. And I just like to talk at sort of a bird's eye view over some of Israel's occupation policies from 1967 to 1987, those first 20 years of Israeli rule in the occupied Palestinian territories. So during those first 20 years, Israel killed on average 32 Palestinians per year. In total, 650 Palestinians were killed. Israel arrested and deported Palestinians who resisted Israel's rule. It frequently and indiscriminately arrested masses of Palestinian protesters. In one instance, in I believe 1976, Israel arrested something like 33,000 Palestinians in mass. Only ended up detaining 8,000 of them. The other 25,000 were just arrested because of Israel's policy of mass detention of protesters. Israel displaced many Palestinians throughout this period to widen security roads, especially along the southern border with Gaza, as well as along the border between Gaza and Israel. Israel banned political expression, so you couldn't organize politically. There was no freedom of speech. Israel regularly shut down Palestinian newspapers coming out of the Palestinian-occupied territories. It was illegal to wave a Palestinian flag. It was illegal to hold a Palestinian flag. It was also illegal to use the name Palestine in the names of organizations. Israel censored Palestinian textbooks that were used in schools in the occupied Palestinian territories. It was a brutal military regime that did not afford anyone the right to a political organization or free speech. Let's talk about the economy of Gaza and the West Bank. And this presentation is focused on Gaza because I think that's what everyone's most interested in right now. But a lot of what I'm saying applies to both Gaza and the West Bank. Both territories are occupied by Israel from 67 to the present. So when Israel implemented its military regime over Gaza, its basic goal was to make Gaza dependent on Israel. Okay, so what it did was it suffocated investment and industry and entrepreneurship by forcing Palestinians to get permits to do anything, right? So in order to conduct business involving land or property or water or electrical work or just to install a generator or install a water device, you needed Israeli permits, which were frequently denied, and if they were not denied, they were hard to get. Israel also created zones exclusively for Israeli fishing vessels, preventing private Gaza fishermen from competing with Israeli fishermen. This was one of Israel's key tactics. Wherever you had Israeli firms, that were, for example, in some Israeli cement firms, Israeli fishermen, Israeli vegetable growers, you saw Israel make it difficult for Palestinians in the occupied territories to compete with those Israeli firms. This was part of Israel's goal of making Palestinians dependent on labor inside Israel, within the state of Israel, at Israeli companies and Israeli firms, rather than face competition from independent Palestinian businesses that would compete with them. And so just to cite a single example here, Israel rendered the planting of new citrus trees without permission illegal and required permits for such actions. And it took, in some cases, 5+ years to get permits just to grow a new citrus tree. So basically making it very hard for Gaza to develop a self-sustaining economic base. The same was true in terms of the financial institutions in the West Bank and Gaza. Israel froze the assets of many Palestine banks. It made it difficult for Palestinians to build capital-intensive investment in Gaza, right? Because if you don't have lending infrastructure and borrowing infrastructure and financial and credit markets, it's hard for a business person in Gaza or Ramallah or wherever else to take out a loan to start a business. So Israel, by destroying the financial institutions within the occupied territories, really suffocated Palestinian investment and industry. And this had disastrous effects on Gaza's economy. In fact, over the course from 1947 to 1987, actually less land was under cultivation in the Gaza Strip than was before 1947. Israel also prohibited Palestinians in Gaza from making critical improvements to the sewage system in Gaza. As a result, by the 1990s in Gaza City, for example, as much as 50% of all piped water was lost as a result of damage to the pipes. And Israel did not allow Gazans to make infrastructural improvements to those pipes, again, owing to all the restrictions around changing making any kind of infrastructural improvements that involve things like pipes and sewage facilities and pumps, etc. Let's keep going. So the other, I think one other point I would make here is that this isn't politics or economics. It's just I would just call it a humanitarian issue here. That you had many families where you have one member of a family living in Gaza and one member of a family living in Israel, and in nearly every single request for family reunification from 1967 to 1987, Israel denied those Gazans the right to join their family members inside Israel. The reasons, of course, are obvious. Israel sees any non-Jews entering Israel and obtaining Israeli citizenship as an inherent threat to the state of Israel, because it's bent on maintaining and preserving a Jewish majority in the state. And so for that reason, thousands of Palestinians were denied the right to join up with their family members inside Israel from 67 to 87. That sort of takes us to the 1980s. And I would say over the course of the late 60s and 70s and early 80s, tension is on the rise. And by the late 70s and early 80s, you had a significant increase in what Israel described as disturbances, which are essentially protests and demonstrations against Israel's occupation policies. And you saw those on the rise from the late 70s onwards through the 80s. There's one poll that I think was really telling when people try to understand why it is that Palestinians, in 1987, revolted in what became known as the first Intifada, the first uprising. There's some very interesting polling data that came out just shortly before the uprising, and I've said it here at the bottom of the slide. So, the following percentage of Palestinians in the occupied territories indicated that they or a member of their immediate family had experienced the following. So 47% of families in the occupied Palestinian territories in 1986 had been arrested for political reasons. 50% had experienced beatings and physical abuse or threats. 56% were harassed or insulted at Israeli military checkpoints. 23% had experienced property or land confiscations. You had 34% of people who were banned from traveling abroad. 74% of Palestinian families in the occupied territories reported experiencing curfews, and you can see here, many had experienced demolition of their homes, deportation or town arrests, fines by military courts. So basically, we're talking 94% of people in Gaza having experienced, threats to their family, political arrests, beatings, land confiscations, curfews, home demolitions, deportations, etc. So overall, a pretty brutal military occupation. The trigger for the first Intifada was when an Israeli truck driver struck and killed 4 Palestinians near a checkpoint at the entrance to Gaza. Over the course of the next few years, Palestinians across the occupied territories organized protests, riots, boycotts of Israeli rule, daily strikes, and infamously stone-throwing children. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this revolt, as well as the brutality of Israel's response to it, in just the first 2 years of the uprising, 175 Palestinians passed through Israeli jails, 30,000 kids needed medical treatment, 20% of the injured Palestinians were children under the age of 5. Okay, you had 23,000 Palestinians subject to harsh interrogation, which is code word for torture, and you had something like Palestinians killed over the course of the revolt, something like 160 Israelis, and over the same time, Israeli military forces killed something like 1,200 Palestinians. And these death tolls are consistent with most of the death tolls, and they're consistent with Israel's long-standing policy of disproportionality, which is however many Israelis get killed, we will ensure that we will kill far more Palestinians in retaliation. Let's talk about the rise of Hamas. I think a subject on everyone's mind right now. In 1973, Ahmed Yassin, who, by the way, was 12 years old in 1948 and experienced the trauma of having lived through the ethnic cleansing of 150,000 Palestinians in 1948. He himself was a refugee, and his family was a refugee that wound up in Gaza after the war. In 1973, he founded an Islamic charity that focused on education, social services, and preaching. It was an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood, founded in Egypt. And the organization, for the most part, was apolitical. I mean, not for the most part, it was completely apolitical in the 70s, engaging in charity activities, education, after-school programs for kids, helping orphans, spiritual guidance, religious programming, etc. And in the 70s and 80s, this organization really developed a strong presence throughout the entire Gaza and as well throughout the West Bank, building in a grassroots way, building kind of networks of cells that would be carrying out all of these social programs and educational programs and religious programs. And, but before getting to the Hamas Charter of 1988, there's a few things I want to say about Gaza, about Hamas, which is that, first of all, in the early 80s, actually, I'll get to this slide later. So let me actually just talk about what I've got here on this slide. So this is even before the Hamas Charter, which of course calls for Israel's destruction and has other terrible things to say. But basically, in 1988, you had multiple Hamas leaders come out and put forward proposals for peaceful resolutions to the conflict. So one of them was this guy Mahmoud al-Zahar, who put out a feeler to Yitzhak Rabin in June 1988. This is 2 months before the Hamas Charter came out, basically proposing a withdrawal from the occupied territories and a restoration of Palestinian rights. Sheikh Yassin, the founder of Hamas himself in 1988, again expressed interest in negotiating with Israel, so long as Israel acknowledged the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, as well as their right to return to their land. These were, of course, complete non-starters for the state of Israel, which never had any intention of allowing any significant number of Palestinians to return to Israel, of course, owing to the fact that those Palestinians would create a demographic threat for Israel, and potentially challenge its Jewish majority. By the late 80s, in August 1988, Hamas publishes this new charter, which, as I said, calls for an Islamic state throughout all of Palestine. Renouncing any part of Palestine means renouncing that part of the religion. The Hamas charter also defines the Palestinian struggle as one against the Jews. And so I think for these reasons, Hamas has, been criticized over the years, and has been deemed a terrorist organization as a result of this 1988 charter. We can debate how relevant it is today and happy to talk about that in the Q&A. The other thing I would mention is that I think when thinking about why Hamas transformed from a nonviolent charity organization to a military resistance organization, was that in the first year of that first Intifada, so from the end of 1987 until the end of 1988, Israel killed something like 140 people in the Gaza Strip. And Palestinians killed a grand total of 0 Israeli soldiers or civilians in the Gaza Strip. And I think it was that incredible brutality and the loss of civilian life on the Palestinian side that radicalized Hamas and perhaps led them to that charter in late 1988. By the late 80s and early 90s, Hamas increasingly turned to military attacks and violent attacks on Israeli civilians. Over the course of the 1990s, Hamas carried out 27 attacks, including 12 suicide bombings, killing 185 Israeli civilians, including many gruesome attacks. You can see footage here, the wreckage of one bus bomb in Jerusalem that Hamas claimed responsibility for. But I think it really wasn't until after Baruch Goldstein, the famous Israeli settler, who massacred 29 Palestinian worshippers in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, the mosque where the patriarch Ibrahim is supposedly buried. It wasn't until after that massacre that Palestinian groups like Hamas really embraced militarism and violent attacks on civilians, kind of I would say as a real kind of dominating military strategy. Before then, there were a few attacks, but it was really after 1994 when Hamas really picked up those indiscriminate attacks on civilians in Israel. And I think throughout the 1990s, Hamas gained in popularity. I think in part this was because they had a lot of funding, they had a lot of donations from abroad, from the Gulf and elsewhere abroad, and they used a lot of that money to spend on schools and social welfare programs and cultural and religious programs and recreational and charity programs alongside their military activities, right? So even alongside those gruesome violent attacks on civilians, at the same time they were offering kids, education, they were opening health clinics, and so they gained a lot of popularity among the on the in Palestinian public opinion. And I think at the same time, Yasser Arafat concentrated power in his hands, especially throughout the mid to late 1990s, did not share power with the Palestinian Legislative Council. And that created openings for organizations and rivals like Hamas. And just by one internal investigation in 1997, and by the way, this was an internal Palestinian Authority investigation. There was something like $300 million, which amounted to a third of its annual budget, was deemed wasteful, and could have been spent on much more important and useful programs. Arafat himself was accused, and his associates were convicted of embezzling tens of millions of dollars from the Palestinian treasury for their own personal benefit, and this as well created openings for rivals like Hamas. We haven't really talked so much about Oslo, and I don't know if we want to get really into the details of Oslo right now, but one of the key principles, maybe we just say a brief word about it. In 1993, Israel signed a peace treaty, signed the Oslo Accords with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which resulted in a number of the creation and the establishment of a number of Palestinian institutions. Of course, the Palestinian Authority, which had an executive branch and had a legislative branch. But the other really principle of Oslo, if you look at the Oslo Accords themselves, was kind of placing Israeli security above all else, right? And above Palestinian democratization, above Palestinian human rights, and above Palestinian development. And if you really understand kind of the whole kind of Oslo mindset was like, if Israel, so long as Israel's security is paramount, so long as Israel, is able to maintain its military and security domination from the river to the sea, well then, we can always make room for little Palestinian, development projects, and maybe give Palestinians some small amount of self-autonomy here and there, and allow Palestinians to develop semi-democratic institutions here and there, always subject to Israeli security needs. That's kind of the guiding principle of Oslo, let's say. And by the way, by Israel's own acknowledgement. And so basically over the course of the 1990s, what you saw was that, you'd have attacks, there'd be say Hamas would, blow up innocent Israeli civilians, and then Israel would impose mass collective punishment on millions of Gazans and millions of West Bank Palestinians in retaliation for those attacks, in some cases preempting those attacks. And so there were closures throughout the occupied Palestinian territories that absolutely decimated the Palestinian economy throughout the 1990s. Again, this was during a time period when Israel was supposedly supposed to be building trust with the Palestinians. Actually, what it was doing, it was eroding trust, shutting down during periods of total lockdowns, which happened throughout the 1990s, in 96 and 97 and 98. You'd have periods of time for many weeks, if not months, where Israel would be locking down entire populations of people, millions of people unable to leave their town or their village or their city. In such time periods, unemployment reached 70% in the Gaza Strip, which is higher than it is even in, just in the months prior to the outbreak of the latest hostilities. So we're talking total devastation, collective punishment imposed on millions of people. I think we got to keep going. So let's another thing worth pointing out here is that during the Oslo peace process, Israel and the Palestinian Authority agreed to a customs union in which Israel would collect taxes on behalf of the Palestinian Authority on goods that were imported, through Israel, whose final destination would be the Palestinian territories, right? Because part of, again, Israel's security needs are always paramount. So anything that goes eventually to Gaza and the West Bank always has to come through Israel first. And Israel, charges the Palestinians, basically a tax, by the way, 3% tax, in order for them to facilitate that transfer of goods from Israel to the Palestinian territories. Israel takes a 3% cut off the top. And throughout the 1990s, what it did in addition to that was it started to withhold taxes on that funding, always in retaliation. And there were always different excuses. In some cases, Israel claimed it was because of a tax. In some cases, it was because of Palestinian Authority policy to pay family members of Palestinians imprisoned by Israel. In some cases, it had nothing to do with security. It was just as a punishment. Just to have leverage over the Palestinians. And so, this is another, again, Israel's security needs are paramount. Anything going through to the Palestinian Authority always has to come through Israel. And this gives Israel additional leverage over Palestinian economy and Palestinian life in the occupied territories. This takes us to 2000, where in after the failure of the Camp David peace negotiations, you had Ariel Sharon go up to the Temple Mount and give a very provocative tour over the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound and Haram al-Sharif compound, which is really called Temple Mount. And during that visit, it sparked outrage. You have to remember at a time when Palestinians and Israelis are trying to build trust and trying to calm the situation. Israel asserts its sovereignty over the most important, the holiest of all Palestinian Muslim sites. That, I believe, is what led to the outbreak of the Second Intifada. But even before getting into that, I think it's worth talking about kind of what some of the factors and causes that led to the outbreak of violence in 2000. So I think I would say, first of all, that during the time period in Oslo, right, from 93 to 2000, when Israel was supposed to be building trust, right, the whole idea was we're going to build trust, we're going to transfer over sovereignty of parts of the West Bank to Israel to the Palestinians gradually over the course of the 90s. So during this time period when Israel is supposed to be demonstrating that it's committed to peace, that it's committed to transferring over control of land to the Palestinians, it actually was expanding settlements. It was expanding the settlement enterprise at a time when it was supposed to be showing its commitment to building trust and to be transferring over that same territory to the Palestinians, right? So it's like by 2000, at the end of the 7-year time period, when at a time when Israel and Palestinians are supposed to be negotiating of how to divide up that land, Israel had already been taking control over it for the previous 7 years. And in fact, the number of settlers in the West Bank and Gaza doubled over that time period. So I think this was a big factor that led to outrage on the Palestinian street. Meanwhile, Palestinians carried out many violent attacks on Israeli civilians, which also eroded trust on the Israeli side. Many Israelis and Palestinians both believed that their use of violence and force was justified and would improve their negotiating position. And I think ultimately, really, what drove, I think, to the extremism on the Palestinian side was also Israel's policies, occupation policies of closures and lockdowns and permits and checkpoints. Again, this was a time when Israel was supposed to be building trust. Instead, it was eroding trust by adding more checkpoints, I think by 2000 there was something like 600 roadblocks and checkpoints within the occupied Palestinian territories. At a time again when both parties were supposed to be building trust, they were actually eroding trust. And as I said, the breakout of the second Intifada came when the Israeli, I think at the time Defense Minister Ariel Sharon sort of asserts sovereignty over the most holy site to Palestinians. And then in the first few weeks after that visit, Israeli forces killed 12 Palestinian children. Okay, this was at a time and which went mostly unreported. 14 Palestinian children, which went mostly unreported in the Israeli media. And this was before this was before you really had very many Jewish victims. There were very few attacks in those first few weeks, and it was only after those 14 Palestinian children were killed that you really saw an explosion in violence. For over the next few years, you had Palestinian militants kill 1,000 Israeli civilians, and of course Israel killing something like 3,000 Palestinians over the course of the second Intifada from 2000 to 2010. Those are the numbers I just cited here. But beyond the death tolls, right, which again always essentially, like I said, Israel's guiding military principle since I would say from 48 to the present has been disproportionality. Is that however many Palestinian Israelis are killed, we will ensure that we kill more Palestinians. And that's exactly what happened during the second Intifada, when even though Palestinians committed all these gruesome attacks against Israelis, 1,000 Israelis dead, of course, Israel committed 3x the number of attacks on Palestinians and killed 3,000 Palestinians over that same time period. But in addition to that, of course, the second Intifada also was a period in which Israel imposed even more closures, even more lockdowns, even more mass arrests, more checkpoints, more home demolitions. In Gaza, for example, they uprooted 200,000 trees and destroyed 10% of Gaza's agricultural land. 4,000 Palestinian homes were demolished, and some 6,000 Palestinians were arrested over the course of that 5-year period. This takes us to 2006, when of course, the Oslo process was dead by 2006. There were no negotiations taking place between Palestinian. There was no real serious negotiations taking place between Israeli leaders and Palestinian leaders. But at the same time, the institutions that were created by the Oslo process survived. One of those institutions was the Palestinian Legislative Council, or the Palestinian National Council, the PNC. And in January 2006, the Palestinian Authority held elections, free and fair democratic elections. There were many observers from independent nonprofit organizations that declared that the elections were free and fair. Hamas, as a result of some of the reasons we've already talked about, won those elections, winning 76 out of 132 seats. Recall, again, Hamas had gained popularity for its investment in Palestinian civil society, for its operation of schools, orphanages, mosques, clinics, and soup kitchens. Fatah, who was being led at the time by Mahmoud Abbas, who is Yasser Arafat's successor, of course, refused to give up power in the Gaza Strip, despite having lost the election there. And we can debate how to call it, whether or not it was a coup, whether or not Palestinians had the right to take power by force. We can debate that. But basically, Hamas took power in Gaza by force in 2007 and has ruled the territory ever since. And of course, as we said, Hamas's charter rejects the international endorsed frameworks for resolving the conflict. It also calls for the destruction of Israel. But I think it's important to remember that Hamas leaders have been incredibly pragmatic over the years. And many statements from many Hamas leaders indicate that actually we're interested in peace and we're interested in negotiation and settlement rather than violence. We already spoke of those two proposals that came in 1988 by two senior Hamas officials trying to propose a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The same thing happened in 2006 when Ismail Haniyeh, a senior Hamas leader, said, we Hamas are for peace and want to put an end to bloodshed. Peaceful means will do for the world if the world is willing to engage in a constructive and fair process in which we and the Israelis are treated equally. Similar comments were made by Khalid Mash'al in 2007 in an interview on CNN. Where he basically said, Palestinians want a country in the 67 borders. And then he said something similar again in April 2008, where he said, look, we agree to a Palestinian state on the pre-67 borders. So basically a Palestinian state in the occupied Palestinian territories of Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. but without recognizing Israel, we have offered a truce if Israel withdraws to those 67 borders, a 10-year 10-year truce. So let's talk about the current political context in Gaza right now. Gaza is currently run by. Let me just say one other thing here. Everything I'm talking about is like pre-October 7th, 2023. Okay, so obviously everything changed then, but we're talking about kind of the situation, kind of the status quo in Gaza before then. So the chief of Hamas was Yahya Sinwar. He had been first chosen in 2017. It's so important to remember that half of Gaza's population is children, and the last election in Gaza was 2006. So for the past 16, 17 years, there's been no free and fair democratic elections in Gaza. So Hamas is not a democratic organization, despite having won democratic elections in 2017. It's a de facto one-party state. Although there are other smaller parties like Islamic Jihad and PFLP that are tolerated, and even Fatah to some extent is tolerated in the territory. But essentially, it's ruled by a single party, which is Hamas. And I think another thing I would point out here is that after the 2021 May 2021 war waged on Gaza, Hamas actually enjoyed a surge in popularity among Palestinians. This is oftentimes the case. We see the same thing happening in Israel right now, right? After Israel's attack, you see this sort of unity. You have a unity government at a time when just a few weeks ago that would have been unthinkable. And I think the polling data coming out right now is mixed. You have, despite continued supports for the concept of resisting military occupation and the concept of resisting Israeli brutal rule, nevertheless, many Gazans have expressed, just in some polling data that came out in 2022, at least somewhat negative views towards Hamas for its corruption and for its lack of democratic policies or practices. Oh, sorry. This slide I've got here, which just to kind of signal the really complex nature of the relationship between Hamas and Israel. Remember, Israel in the 1980s funded and supported and helped Hamas grow. And the reason for that was, it's not really well appreciated, but the reason for that was because, recall Israel's main adversary throughout the late 60s, 70s, and even well into the 80s was the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And Israel pursued a classic kind of colonial policy of divide and conquer. If my adversary is divided rather than united, they're going to be much easier to defeat. And that was exactly the thinking that went into the support for Hamas, for the funding of Hamas in the early 80s. Now you might call that a classic case of blowback. But Israel actually supported Hamas throughout the 80s. Of course, that changed by the 90s when it was very clear that Hamas was embracing a policy of militarism. But nevertheless, Israel helped give rise to the creation of Hamas and funded it in the 80s. And those are we know that because it was the Israeli officials in charge of that policy that came out in the 2000s and said that. So that's not really disputed. And I think the other point I would make here is that by the mid 2010s, there was this belief on the Israeli side that Hamas was an asset, not a liability. Let me repeat that. By 2015, 16, 17, many, if not most, political leaders inside Israel believed Hamas was an asset rather than a liability. Why is that? Number one, Israel for many decades now has tried to drive a wedge between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and so whatever it could possibly do to weaken Hamas, that would presumably strengthen the PA, and Israel would just much rather have kind of those two forces competing and with one another. Your adversary is always much harder to defeat if it's divided than if it's united. And I think more important than that was that Bezalel Smotrich in 2011 came out with this comment that Hamas is an asset. Bibi Netanyahu has said similar things over the past few years, and I think in part that's because the entire international community, the United States, the European Union, is more or less of the consensus that Hamas is a terrorist organization. And so when Israel has basically what the world perceives to be a terrorist organization on its southwestern flank, that gives the state of Israel almost cover fire. It almost gives the state of Israel a smokescreen to pursue its policies of home demolitions and ethnic cleansing and expansion of settlements, and depopulating Palestinian villages in areas where Israel wants to expand settlements. So basically, I think Hamas gives Israel this cover fire and this smokescreen to pursue Israel's policies of apartheid and ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem and the West Bank, which is the area it really cares about. So those would be the thoughts I would share on that point. Now, recall in 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip. It withdrew its 7,000 settlers, or excuse me, 6,000 settlers from the Gaza Strip in what was infamously known as the disengagement plan. I think most observers and analysts were keen to point out that, Israel was presenting itself as making these painful sacrifices for peace, all the while returning Gaza to the Palestinian returning Gaza to the Palestinians. I think these points were mostly propaganda because, of course, Israel did not return Gaza to the Palestinians. Israel still maintained control of Gaza's population registry, its airspace, its coastal waters, 6 of its 7 land borders. It maintained control of its water, its telecommunication network, and its internet. And so there was never any real attempt to return Gaza to the Palestinians and let Gazans make the key decisions. There was always a desire to maintain as much control, at least from the outside of Gaza, as possible. I think an apt analogy could be that imagine having a lot of protests inside of a prison. So what Israel did was, instead of keeping let's say prison guards inside a prison, instead of keeping prison guards patrolling the halls of the prison, instead they just withdrew to the perimeter, controlled all the gates and all the exit and entry points of the prison, and let Palestinians make the decisions on which prisoner gets how much food and which prisoner gets to go out into the courtyard for a break. But basically, from the outside, Israel maintained complete control of the Gaza Strip and colluded with Egypt to make sure that the 7th land border, the Rafah crossing with Egypt, also was kept closed. Shortly thereafter, after Hamas's takeover, Israel implemented a blockade and a siege on Gaza. That's why for the past 16 years, the Gaza Strip has been called an open-air prison. Almost no one enters or exits the Gaza Strip. The blockade has severely restricted freedom of movement of people and goods in and out of the Gaza Strip. This has led to many international observers to call this a war crime, a collective punishment, because it's leading to mass devastation and a humanitarian crisis among civilians, not among militants. 40% of the population of, again, these are all numbers prior to October 7th, 2023. 40% of Gaza's population was living in poverty, most of them extreme poverty. More than 80% of people in the Gaza Strip were dependent on food handouts by the UN and other humanitarian organizations, and 90% of Gazans lacked access to safe drinking water. Again, as I said, there's been a consensus among international human rights organizations that the Israeli blockade on Gaza constitutes a form of collective punishment and therefore a violation of international law. Quote, the blockade was inflicting disproportionate damage on the civilian population of Gaza. And I think one of the principal motives behind the imposition of Gaza, according to Israeli leaders at the time, was to punish the people of Gaza for having elected Hamas. Thus, by Israeli leaders' own admission, this was a punishment on civilian populations rather than an attempt to actually prevent Hamas from strengthening its military capacity. And for that reason, many humanitarian rights experts called this illegal under international law. Hamas has also taken an active role in the Palestinian economy, was actually been quite harmful in many cases. It's harming fish farms. It's creating large scale investments in agricultural processes, competing with the private sector. Hamas was able to also gain a footing in financial and banking sectors. This is just some background on Gaza's rule in the economy. Hamas's rule in the economy of Gaza. In 2010, there have been many attempts, by the way, to break the siege on Gaza. Long before 2010, you had an organization, I believe it was called Break the Siege on Gaza or something to that effect, which sent humanitarian missions to the Gaza Strip to try and break the blockade. In the most infamous instance of that, you had a Turkish humanitarian mission that sent a ship carrying aid and construction materials with the intention of breaking the siege on Gaza. In May 2010, Israeli forces boarded the ships with speedboats and helicopters, and and killed 10 activists in cold blood. And these were shot in many cases. These were Israeli snipers that shot these Turkish humanitarian workers from a distance. And so the Israel, as a result, according to at least one UN report, there were indications that 6 of the people on the flotilla showed signs that they were executed. And in response to those executions, you had U.S. international community come out and call for investigations into the crimes. At the very least, the U.S. called Israel to apologize. Netanyahu refused. Let's continue along. I know we only have 10 minutes, and I believe we still have a number of slides to get through. So let me try my best to move as quickly as I can. But from here on, I want to talk through really some the humanitarian toll, the cost that the people of that has been incurred by the people of Gaza for Israel's brutal siege and blockade. So just at the most basic level, the vast majority of people are not able to leave the Gaza Strip for any reason. Save for a very brief period of time in 2012-13, when Mohamed Morsi came to power in Egypt. There was a brief period of time when that border was was open. But aside from that brief period of time, very few Gazans are granted exit permits. Israel has also expanded the restricted area around the Gaza Strip, to 300 meters, destroying an incredibly necessary Palestinian farmland. And making it difficult to carry out any kind of agricultural activity in that perimeter region. We already cited some of the employment numbers. Here you have, just in 2023, unemployment in Gaza was nearly 50%. Youth unemployment was 75%. Most Gazans live off of, even in the public sector, living off of $27 a day. And many have only been receiving partial salaries. In the private sector, you're talking about people living off, these are among the people who are employed. Remember, 50% of people are unemployed. Among the people that are employed, $9 a day among private sector employees. Quote, the ongoing restrictions imposed by Israel on movement of goods and people is a key factor in Gaza's dire economic situation. Of course, we also have an electricity crisis. This, again, long before October 2023. Because Israel prevents the restoration of Gaza's only power plant, that has impeded infrastructural repairs and upgrades to that power plant. Gaza cannot import enough fuel to operate that power plant, and so it operates at a fraction of its capacity. And so as a result, you have rolling blackouts more or less on an ongoing basis from 2007 to the present. In 2020, there were rolling blackouts for 12 to 15 hours a day. Same thing in 2011 and 2012. The electricity crisis, of course, only worsens the water crisis because you need electricity to pump water. And so Gaza's wells and Gaza's desalination plants need electricity. And when in times of power shortages, you only have water being supplied into people's homes and people's factories for about 2 hours a day. Of course, the electricity crisis also causes harm to hospitals, which obviously need electricity to operate medical equipment. They are relying on backup generators in order to provide essential services to medical patients. Basically all non-urgent surgeries are deferred. Patients are discharged earlier than they ought to be. Water pumps cannot function properly, which is having a detrimental impact on the water supply and the ability for hospitals to provide medical treatment. The power cuts have also forced many Gazans to resort to burning firewood to cook, which has led to increases in respiratory diseases and pneumonia and tuberculosis and chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. The electricity crisis is also impeding the ability for anyone to do any work at night, which is leading to heightened risk for Gaza's construction workers. And with only 6 hours of day, Gazans cannot even operate fans to keep cool, leading to worries of heat strokes and in just this past summer. Sorry. You also have a raw sewage crisis. Again, in order for sewage treatments, in order to be able to operate normally, you need electricity. Again, as a result of the shortage of power and electricity, you have a massive amount of raw sewage that's being flowed into the Mediterranean Sea. And so in 2017, for example, the one report found that 73% of Gaza's coastline was dangerously polluted with sewage, and that sewage was also running through the streets of Gaza, increasing the prevalence of waterborne diseases. And in fact, something like 26% of diseases in Gaza are related to dirty water, owing to Gaza's inability to treat that water because it doesn't have enough electricity for the water sewage treatment facilities. Israel also denies access to something like 50% of the fishing waters that were supposed to be allocated to Gaza, to the Palestinians under the Oslo Accords. And that over the past 17 years has led to a 50% reduction in Gaza's fishing sector capacity. In addition, restrictions on the imports of motors and other parts is leading to a deterioration in the fishing fleet. Fishermen and then on top of all that, those fishermen that venture out, they're oftentimes shot at by Israel. In 2022 alone, there were 300 shooting incidents. This stuff barely even gets reported. 14 fishermen were injured and 47 fishermen were detained for having breached the area where Israel allows Gazan fishermen to enter. Again, we talked about the water and the sanitation and the hygiene crisis. We said that 90% of Gazans do not have access to a clean drinking water. If you turn on a tap in 90% of homes in Gaza Strip, you will get salt water coming out. 78% of piped water, it's unfit for human consumption. The groundwater in Gaza has rapidly deteriorated. Something like 90% of available groundwater is undrinkable. The water pollution is also a huge factor, and it's increasing. The incidence, as we said, of waterborne diseases, 13 to 14% increase every year in the number of patients admitted with kidney problems to Gaza City's Shifa Hospital. Again, this is all before October 7th, 2023. Less than 16% of items needed to construct those vital water facilities are reaching Gaza, again, owing to Israel's blockade and the prevention of those materials from entering Gaza. There's a shelter crisis in addition to all the other crises that we've talked about. We're going to get to the wars on Israel, and we're going to have to hurry through a few slides here. But basically, you still have 7,000 Palestinians who are still homeless from the 2021 war. Okay, you had in between the wars in August 2022, you had 1,500 housing units were damaged or destroyed. You had 120,000 Palestinians in Gaza that are living in 21,000 homes that have no windows or safe roofs or doors. In December 2022, Israel opened dam gates and levees along the perimeter fence in East Gaza, causing flooding in many homes and destroying, leaving 100 families in need. You have a public health crisis, as we talked about. I'm going to move through this slide quickly because we're running out of time, but you also have a health crisis in Gaza. And as a result, so many Gazans are not able to receive the medical treatment they need. As a result, they apply for exit permits to try and get the medical treatment they need outside of Gaza. And in 2022 alone, Israel denied more than 20,000 requests by Gazan patients to receive medical treatment abroad. In one case, Fatima al-Masri, who was a 1.5-year-old baby girl, died in 2022 after Israel refused to allow her to exit Gaza for needed medical treatment, for medical treatment that would have saved her life. Instead, she died. Let's keep going. You also have a mental health crisis in Gaza. Just absolutely staggering figures. More than half of Gaza's children have contemplated suicide. As far as I can tell, that's the highest rate of kids contemplating suicide in the world. 71% of the adult population is screened for depression. Just from 2018 to 2022, the mental health crisis was significantly worsened, and the number of children reporting feeling fearful and nervous or depressed or grieved increased to astronomical levels. There's obviously a food security crisis. We already said that, a huge percent of the population is dependent on food handouts, and and as a result of poorly diversified diets, it's causing overlapping nutrition problems. Nearly 50% of people basically do not even have the essential minerals and vitamins they need. Education is also impacted. Many students are not able to get access to education has been severely impacted by Israel's attacks and its blockade on Gaza, by the electricity crisis in 2008, 9, 2012, and 2014. In those conflicts and those wars that Israel waged on Gaza, Israel attacked Palestinian educational institutions. It destroyed 18 schools and caused damage to another 280 schools in the Gaza Strip during those military attacks on Gaza. And we're kind of in the final inning here, and so I just want to kind of run through basically the previous, let's call it 4 or 5 wars that Israel has waged on Gaza over the past 16 years. All told, it killed 3,500 Palestinians, wounded another 15,000 Palestinians, at the same time that Hamas and other Palestinian groups killed 185 Israelis. Again, this is consistent with Israel's military principle of disproportionality. Israeli actions during these conflicts were described to be apparent war crimes. In every single one of those military conflicts, human rights organizations called Israel's attacks on Gaza, they describe them as apparent war crimes that were imposing collective punishment and using disproportionate force on the civilian populations in Gaza. Hamas and Islamic Jihad actions have also been described as apparent war crimes, owing to the indiscriminate attacks on the Israeli civilian population centers located in the vicinity of Gaza. In 2008, Israel waged one of its most deadly wars on Gaza, in which it killed 1,400 Palestinians, including 550 children. The Goldstone report, which was a report intended to investigate war crimes, it investigated 11 incidents in which the Israeli military launched direct attacks on civilians with lethal outcomes. In 10 of the 11 incidents that were investigated, no justifiable military objective was found, concluding that Israeli objective in this operation was to, quote, punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population. Israel targeted critical infrastructure, destroying flour mills, destroying nearly all of the cement factories, and reducing the Gazan people to abject poverty and dependence on Israel. Israel targeted holy sites during the war, and again, at the same time that Israel killed 1,400 Palestinians, Palestinian militant groups killed 4 Israeli civilians. Operation Pillar Defense, 2012, Israel's second war on Gaza. The first shot was fired when Israel assassinated Hamas's second in command, Ahmed Jabari, who, by the way, just a few hours before he was assassinated, he had received a draft of a peace deal that was formulated had already received approval by then Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak. And he had received this this draft of this peace deal, and Jabari was expected to sign it. And shortly after, a few hours after he received the peace deal, Israel assassinated him. That triggered a 8-day war in which Israel killed 171 Palestinians, including more than 100 civilians, including 35 children. Hamas, at the same time, fired many rockets into Israel, killing 4 Israeli civilians in what the Human Rights Watch also described as apparent war crimes. Let's move on. In 2014, this was the third war Israel waged on Gaza. It was the longest and most destructive war on Gaza to date. Israel killed 1,500 Gazan civilians, 2,200 Gazans total, 550 children. Israel launched 6,000 airstrikes on Gaza, mostly on residential buildings. Now, in this case, the UN investigated 15 incidents in which Israel struck civilian areas and killed 216 people. In those 15 investigated incidents, in 6 of them, there was no information or explanation why residential buildings were found. There was no justifiable military target identified. And so the conclusion among the UN was that Israel quite likely committed countless war crimes during that war. Similarly, Hamas killed 6 Israeli civilians in indiscriminate rocket attacks on Israel. That takes us to 2018. Beginning in March 2018, tens of thousands of Gazans descended along the border, protesting the blockade and the siege on Gaza, demanding the right of return. And these were overwhelmingly peaceful protesters, peaceful marchers. During the first few months of those weekly marches, from March 2018 to May 2018, Israel killed a few dozen Palestinian protesters. Then, on a single day, May 14th, 2018, Israel committed a massacre. It slaughtered 60 Palestinians on a single day. Israeli snipers permanently wounded, led to life-changing wounds, 6,000 Palestinians over the course of these Gaza March of Return protests that carried on for a year and a half. And by the end of that year and a half period of weekly protests against the wall, Israel had slaughtered something like 223 Palestinians, and not a single Israeli experienced any physical harm. What I would say the fifth war on Gaza was waged in 2021. That war broke out after a series of escalations in which Israel was pushing forward plans to uproot 58 Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. And at the same time, we're talking May 2021, you had many Palestinians headed to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is during the holiest night of Ramadan. Israel forced them off the buses, forced them to finish a multi-kilometer journey on foot. Israel also attacked Palestinians sitting, peacefully at Damascus Gate, unprovoked attacks on Palestinians in Jerusalem. In this, we're talking May 2021. Police then stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the holiest Palestinian Muslim site, shooting rounds of stun grenades and tear gas at worshippers inside the mosque. That led Hamas to fire rockets into Israel, which led Israel to start dropping bombs on Gaza in an aerial assault. At the height of that war, there were 113,000 internally displaced Palestinians, and there are still, as of October 2023, there were still many thousands of Palestinians displaced from that war. Israel killed 260 Palestinians during that war and wounded more than 2,000, while at the same time Palestinians killed 14 Israelis. And a final report by the war monitoring group Airways found that in 70% of the airstrikes that killed civilians in Gaza, there was no corresponding militant or military targets found. Again, leading many organizations to describe Israel's assault on Gaza as a war crime. We've talked about Hamas's indiscriminate attacks on civilians from the mid-2000s onwards. Hamas fired many rockets into Israel. We've talked about those attacks during each war in 2008, in 2012, in 2021, and 2014. The other thing I would mention as well is that Hamas has also executed Palestinians unlawfully in the Gaza Strip. Palestinians it deems are collaborators with Israel, and Palestinians it deems are traitors will be executed in the Gaza Strip. 25 of them have been executed since in 2014 alone. Israeli cities and towns have faced barrage rocket attacks from Gaza over the years. And since 2001, at least 28 Israelis have been killed in those attacks. And 40% of Israeli children in the Gaza border area towns of Sderot suffer from anxiety and PTSD as a result of those rocket attacks. Media access to Gaza has been severely limited over the years. Israel regularly bars journalists from entering Gaza. In fact, in the May 2021 war, Israel targeted media outlets as a strategy. It destroyed 20 Palestinian regional and international media outlets in Gaza. In fact, Israel deliberately spread misinformation during that war. In May 2021, Israel informed international media outlets that it was preparing a ground invasion in Gaza, and those international media outlets reported that, as they often do, uncritically. that was obviously just a decoy. That was a military tactic to get Hamas fighters to congregate in the north of Gaza. And so Israel uses disinformation as a war strategy, in addition to preventing journalists from entering Gaza and preventing media outlets from reporting in Gaza because of bombing them. And so all of this makes Israeli military statements very hard to verify. And so there's this kind of media blackout on Gaza. And so if you watch media outlet in almost any single war, there's always going to be oftentimes much more coverage of Israeli civilian casualties than there will be of Palestinian civilian casualties, because Israel does not allow foreign reporters access to Gaza. And that is my last slide. So I think I've gone on for probably over an hour, and I apologize for that. But I think maybe Sahar, Dr. Aziz, I will pass it back to you if you want to share anything before, I think, turning to a Q&A. I think you're muted.
Thank you very much, Dr. Foster. That was thorough, comprehensive, and informative. However, it doesn't do justice to 75 years of the occupation of Palestinians, but at least it does provide some of the key information that is often not included in media coverage and in our public education and private education about the Middle East. So I will encourage people to use the Q&A with questions, which I will moderate and field. In the meantime, I'll just ask Dr. Foster, can you go through the slides of the resources so that people can see it on your screen in case they want to see some books or videos? We have some resources that you can see here. Sarah Roy's book, The Gaza Strip, The Political Economy of De-Development, Noam Chomsky, Ilan Pape, Frank Barat, Gaza in Crisis, Reflections on Israel's War Against the Palestinians, Gideon Levy, the book, The Punishment of Gaza, Raja Shahada, who has many excellent books. One that we're recommending is When the Bulbuls Stopped Singing, Life in Palestine During an Israeli Siege. Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick, the book Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, and Norman Finkelstein, the book Gaza, An Inquest into Martyrdom. Do you want to go through the others just so people can see? So we have some resources here. There's some documentaries, Gaza Fights for Freedom. Another one is called Gaza, Born in Gaza, Gaza Surf Club, Gaza 60-Minute Warning, and Gaza in Context. And then we also have just various media sources that tend to be more progressive in terms of providing the perspectives and experiences of Palestinians. And many of those who write and publish are of various racial, religious backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds that are both Palestinian and Israeli and Jewish and Muslim and Christian authors. 972 Magazine, Eye on Palestine, Electronic Intifada, Mondo Weiss, Al Jazeera, and Shabaka are some resources. And then finally, you can also look at certain civil society groups, mainly NGOs, human rights groups, that tend to do a lot of the documentation on the ground. So Gisha is one, Gisha, and the Al-Haq is another, Alhaq. Beit Salam, which is an Israeli, also, all of these, I believe, are based in Palestine, Israel, is also a human rights group. Adala, Foundation for Middle East Peace, and Adamir. So these are also sources that you can look at in terms of reports. And then do we have one final resource? That's it. And then I'll just, that's it. Then I'll just encourage you to follow us on csrr.rutgers.edu and follow our social media. Okay, so, well, thank you everyone for joining us. If you found this informative, if you found the presentation helpful, I would encourage you to donate to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Any amount is welcome. csrr.rutgers.edu, press donate. We are making our best efforts to educate the public, and we do this free of charge to the public. And our role is to bring the perspectives, the voices, the experiences of those who self-identify within the diverse communities of Muslim, Arab, and South Asians in the United States, as well as their family and friends abroad. And with that, I want to thank Dr. Foster for lending his expertise and for this excellent presentation that is so well researched. please follow us on our newsletter and stay tuned for our next event, which will be on November 10th, featuring Khalid Beydoun talking about his book, The New Crusade, Global Islamophobia. So with that, I wish you all peace, and thank you very much.